This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 120.
And the world around me was saying, no, you can't, that's wrong. And, oh, no. It just was such a contradiction that was very convicting. And then I actually really enjoyed reading the research, and I could find the explanations, both in theory and in experiments that explained what I had witnessed.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Ken Erman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt, the ABC 123 Rogers. Matt, what's going on, man?
Sounds like my reading instruction today. Went back to basics a little bit.
Yeah, so we had a really fun conversation tonight that was much different than what we've had before. We had an expert on the science of reading, and I want to touch on that very briefly in our intro before we jump into our conversation. But I actually was reflecting today as I knew we had a recording tonight, and the question that we ask every guest every week in our exit ticket, question number 3, which is your question, is about how we get through the moments of struggle. And it's a question that I've never answered myself on our podcast. And what made me reflect about that is I am burning the candle at about 6 ends right now at work. And I have said many times to the teachers I work with, especially when I'm running PD with them, I always end the PD saying, anything you learned here that you liked and you want to try with your kids, let me know. I will create it. I will facilitate it. I will do it so that you can see it in action, because your job is harder than mine. And I believe that through and through. A teacher is a much harder job than a coach. But what's interesting about coaching is that wave, it hits you when you least expect it. Like as teachers, you know when those waves come. It's the report cards, it's the conferences. My schedule can just be blown up out of nowhere. And so I want to answer that question now, because I almost want to just give myself advice in how I'm managing that. And my answer to that is you have to have a way to evaluate if something is an emergency or not. And what I mean by emergency is not someone's health at risk, but does it need to happen right now? So I get bombarded with emails, and a lot of times it's teachers asking for help. And I always respond within a day, but my instinct, my desire is to answer immediately, because I just want to satisfy the teacher emailing me. But sometimes I have to look at it and say, after the teacher sends me this email, they probably forget that they sent it. Like they're not waiting at their computer, needing that answer to move on to something new. So I can say to myself, I can answer that tomorrow, right? And so my advice with that question is, when you are in those moments of struggle, just segment. Is this a right now or is this a tomorrow? And push things to tomorrow. And if you're pushing it tomorrow, be okay with it. Know that doing it tomorrow is doing it to its fullest capability. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm glad I can be here for your therapy moment.
You're welcome.
But no, I think it's true.
I won't charge you either.
Yeah, that's great. I think what's interesting, at least in my master's in instructional technology, I think there was a portion of it, and I can't remember the exact name, but it was essentially like a risk assessment. Like, is this a 5-alarm fire, or is this something that seems preventative? And then you have to recognize, did the person who's making these requests come in with good preparation and it's falling apart? Or if they're throwing it together at the last minute, not that they deserve to be pushed off later on, but We're at the time of the year. The way we're recording this right now is I am 1 week away from PSSAs, our state standard assessment, where I'm giving math, reading, and social studies against the next 2 weeks. My brain is swirling with what should I be using these last valuable moments. Realistically, nothing I teach this week is going to mean anything. I can teach a few strategies. I can kind of go business as usual, but the more I make about it, the less that it will produce the outcome I want, because anxiety creeps in. So that risk assessment, make sure the kids are good, make sure you are good, do what you can, and I will validate that. Sometimes I send emails so that it can be checked off my to-do list, and then I depend on you to respond back to me. If it wasn't important for you to write back to me immediately, then it wasn't that important for me to deal with yet. So unless it's something you need immediately, yeah, take that moment, take that break. But transitioning a little bit, I think tonight's conversation is tapping into that risk assessment as well. We have, as you mentioned, an expert. Marnie is a absolute fanatic about the foundational skills of reading and the injustice of a lot of kids reaching higher levels of elementary, middle, and high school not being able to be competent readers or on grade level. And I appreciate she has a standard that is everyone needs to be on grade level. There are some extraneous circumstances that some kids aren't. But if you are a student coming into your classroom, there's no reason that your goal setting is not on grade level. And I love that black and white expectation, because I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like I found myself finding and allowing plenty of excuses to justify things not happening right now. And at the end of the day, guys, you're right. My entire purpose of why I got into teaching is not to get 80% of my class to the destination. It wasn't to be okay with leaving 2 or 3 behind. Now that's a lot of pressure, but if my efforts and goal setting are to do that, I can live with me putting the effort and setting up the chance for that to be successful, and rather than allowing myself that wiggle room before I start.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it was a really in-depth conversation on a topic that we haven't talked about specifically on the show, and I'm excited as our podcast has continued. I love the bread and butter of our show, which is just getting amazing teachers on and just learning about them and what makes their classroom tick, and pulling out those strategies, but also bringing in an expert like Marnie on a very specific subject to really dig deep into the strategies that teachers can use in their classroom. So I would love to transition right into that conversation now. So let's hear from Teach Better and bring in Marnie Ginsberg.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcast. Now let's get back to the episode.
Hi, Marnie. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing tonight?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. So please officially introduce yourself. Let our audience know where you are coming from, and give us a snapshot of what your career in education has looked like.
Well, my name is Marnie Ginsberg. I'm living in Colorado Springs, Colorado now for almost 2 years, and loving the weather and the mountain views. Grew up in South Texas where it was flat as a pancake. I started my career as a middle school English language arts teacher, a little bit of social studies thrown in there, and I moved from Pennsylvania my first year down to North Carolina, and my kids in this mostly blue-collar community were not reading well. And I finally figured out that they were reading on average about the 4th grade level. And I also realized quite quickly I didn't know what to do. I had that secondary English degree, and these kids couldn't read words. So all the training that I had was almost useless because they weren't there yet. So I searched high and low, for answers. This was in the late 90s. So I went, everybody was either saying whole language or phonics to solve this problem. And it's completely contradictory advice. And no one was really saying, oh, you can solve this, in a short period of time, which is what I thought these kids deserved. And so I tried a few things, nothing worked. Finally stumbled upon something that I used with two kids who couldn't even read Hop on Pop. They weren't even at the first grade level. They were in my 6th grade class. They'd been in school for 7 years, couldn't really read. And I tried it with them before school during Channel 1. For those of you who are old enough to know, that was like a news thing. I don't know how long it's been going on, but after school when I could get the kids. And they went up to the middle of the 3rd grade year in the end with that instruction, which was a huge leap, but they were still far behind. And this got me obsessed about, why did I not know how to teach reading? Why was it so confusing when you looked at the literature? And how come I could actually make such a big difference in just a couple months with this program? So that changed my whole trajectory of my career. I stopped public school teaching and became a private reading tutor, and I was getting kids to grade level really rapidly, and was super excited about it. But then when they go into the public school system or private school, they would often tell them, oh no, don't do that. Don't look at the letters. Don't try to sound it out. Just look at the picture, make a prediction, these types of things. So that led me to think, well, maybe we need to do some research on this. And I went to grad school at the University of North Carolina, and I got there and I felt kind of silly because there's tons of research. We do know that at least some of the broad brushstrokes ideas that I'd been swimming in about let the kid look at the picture and make a prediction, that was not how the brain learns to read. And we knew that, but it just wasn't getting disseminated to kids. And then as I was studying in my doctoral program, I had the chance to create an intervention that was federally funded for kindergarten and 1st grade struggling readers. And that was got really good effects for these struggling readers in low-income rural communities. And over multiple research articles that the researchers on our team did, it kept getting good results. It's on the What Works Clearinghouse. It's called the Targeted Reading Intervention. And I was really excited to be able to kind of like get closer to the fulfillment of what I kind of got me so upset initially. But at the same time, this idea didn't spread anywhere. You've probably never heard of the targeted reading intervention. Nobody did it except the schools that we were in the research program for, despite good effects. So when my husband moved us from North Carolina to Wisconsin, I decided to have more of a grassroots approach. And I took some of those ideas from the targeted reading intervention and created a way to spread it more broadly. And that's what I've been doing for the last almost 10 years, Reading Simplified. And that is just professional learning to learn a streamlined approach for how to teach anyone how to read, and at the same time give the kids accelerated achievement. And we do that through a membership called the Reading Simplified Academy. So it's online training. People can come in and learn at their own rate, but we also give them individualized feedback on a discussion board and all the materials they need to work with kids. And it's been very gratifying to kind of get closer to what I wanted, like literally 20 plus years ago, when I was so frustrated with my situation as a teacher myself.
I really want to spend most of our conversation focused on this targeted reading intervention and the program you've created and the strategies that teachers can think about in applying in their own classroom. But I want to step back to this moment of realization for you. How did you realize that your students were reading below grade level so significantly? And that could be a simple answer, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, there was many teachers before you. Were they ignoring it, or were they not putting themselves in situations where they could actually realize if the students could read or not on grade level? So how did you realize it? And then also, where did you get the courage to do what you were not supposed to do because you knew it would be best for the kids?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I listen to them read. That was the first step. I mean, I had 80 plus kids, but I could listen to them read. And I noticed that they didn't recognize words. So even any kind of multi-syllable word that they would attack, they could only kind of come up with something based on the first letter. So if the word was interest, they might say integer or interrogate if they knew that word. And we had very little assessment data. We had the North Carolina end of grade test, which just gave the kids a score of 1, 2, 3, or 4. But that didn't tell me, okay, so a lot of them were 2s. That doesn't tell you what to do. So part of that searching for me was how do you determine what actually you need to do? And I found out that, the first step is to come up with a grade level, like what reading level were these kids? So I had them all read passages at a certain grade level and see which ones they could comprehend. And that's where I came up with, on average, they were literally at the 4th grade level, all 80 of those kids. And that took a lot of time. And yeah, you're right. That wasn't part of my curriculum. I just kind of got them started reading something or listening to something I don't remember and pulled one kid at a time. It was across a couple of weeks to come up with that. And that was the beginning of realizing, okay, this is not okay. And I had a pretty good principal. I didn't actually discuss too much about it with him, but I think that was part of where the courage came from, and just the outrage that this is not the way the system should work. Reading is not that hard to do. Everyone that with sight is capable of doing it, and at least at some basic level. And your average kid should be reading at grade level. So that was my assumption. I don't know where that came from, but I was not going to tolerate it. And I did have the flexibility to kind of wiggle around. I mean, it was some of it was just so ridiculous. I was supposed to have them read. Well, there was no real curriculum, but they said, read these books. So they had book sets of Adam of the Road, which is a Middle Ages text. It's really, I think, at the 7th grade level. So I was like, I could read it to them. And I did that for some of the texts, but that was 3 years above their grade level, and it would be really torturous to get through. So anyway, there was a lot of adjustments that I made that year, both of these 2 years when I was at that school, to try to figure out how to meet their needs. And I guess actually part of what helped, it was kind of ridiculous because the curriculum is so vague. And I think many English language arts teachers can relate to this. It's been this way for so long, even since the Common Core. The students will summarize a fiction text, or the students will be able to read poetry, and that doesn't tell you anything about that's so broad. Which poems, of what level, and when do I do it, and do I create all that myself? So because it was so open-ended, other than those books, and then we had to prepare them for the end of grade writing exam, I just adjusted to what I thought was their what I've come to call their most pressing need. And that's how the targeted reading intervention and Reading Simplified is designed, that we teach the teacher to think diagnostically, so he or she can come up with what the child in front of them really needs and do that, and not all the things. Because when a kid's behind in literacy and reading, there's so many things that a teacher can pretty easily get overwhelmed by. Oh my gosh, this child can't spell, they can't read single syllable words, let alone multi-syllable words, they don't have the vocabulary, their handwriting is terrible. You just get overwhelmed. So you have to kind of zero in on, okay, what's the foundational thing that's going to move us at least from A to B, and then we'll worry about B to C later.
One of the things, and forgive me for making this comparison, but I feel like in my interpretation, everyone has their, I'll say program-wise, has their theory on how they can get their readers to proficiency. And I'm talking more the big box style curriculums, like this is the how to do it curriculum. And one of the challenges that I struggle with is frequently reading is effort-based. It is outside factors based. When we're looking at the standard protocols of a running record or an IRI or any of those assessments where we're acknowledging the reading ability, and it feels very weight loss journey-esque. And so in that realm of, am I supposed to go keto? Am I supposed to go vegan? Am I supposed to go carnivore? Like everyone is prompting, hey, we're going to be successful. And to be honest, I'm sitting on this side of the camera saying, I am one of those teachers that feels very overwhelmed and know where to look. If I'm leveling my books based off Bass, and then we change it to Lexile, and then we change it to someone else's perspective, and we adopt a new curriculum, it feels very overwhelming to say, what is the trusted source? What is actually the core? So that preface to say, where did you feel like you were starting to cut through and move from frustration towards, I know what's good for kids, I know what works for kids? Because we here love any decision that's good for kids, regardless what it is, give it a shot. What were some of your clues? And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but kind of speak to that a little bit further of, I can be in this seat and want to do better for kids, but I don't know where to start, or I can trust the process, but let me see what the sequence is like so I know where I'm heading.
Well, for me, it was very experiential at first. That's what got me started. And then I read research, and that helped me put those pieces together. When those two boys learned to read in front of me, in front of my very eyes, and then I replicated that and got better with others, and the world around me was saying, no, you can't, that's wrong. And oh, no. It just was such a contradiction that was very convicting. And then I actually really enjoyed reading the research, and I could find the explanations, both in theory and in experiments, that kind of that explained what I had witnessed. And so that's what I've been trying to do ever since, is just try to continue learning from the research, but also putting it into practice with, I've had a lot of clinical experience, a lot of one-on-one, and then I've had this opportunity to work with a lot of teachers and watch them. And so if it's not working, I'm not going to keep doing it. But I've also read enough to know that there's a good case for the things that I'm making, the decisions I'm making.
What was something that really jumped out to you in your pursuit of practice and research initially? So you mentioned look at the pictures and make a prediction of what you're reading.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So what was something else that really caught you off guard or surprised you as to being very contradictory to what research is telling us that is possibly common practice in many classrooms?
Well, back in the day, the whole language was the mindset, and that just didn't make sense to me, because I thought these kids have seen a lot of print. Just immersion's not going to cut it anymore. So I was looking for a phonics solution. So I tried a lot of different phonics things, and it wasn't until I found the book called Reading Reflex, where they explained how some kids don't really get access to the phonics because of phonemic awareness, which is the perception of the individual sounds and words. And so traditional phonics instruction is less efficient for these types of kids. There's so much research that we know now that phonemic awareness is highly predictive of early reading, and it really supports it. And as you become a reader, you get really good at it. And so they developed a program that just put those two pieces together from the very beginning, so kids could crack the code and make headway. So that was when I first read that book, I was like, I actually was pretty convinced as soon as I read it. I was like, oh, this is different. That's different from that phonics stuff I've tried. It was certainly different from all the whole language that this kids had been immersed in. And I kind of felt that it would work. So I did have that belief. And then I tested it out, and I got more conviction.
I think just kind of adding to it, Ken, I thought it was interesting. So we adopted a new curriculum, CKLA, which I'm
Oh, yeah. There's some roots of phonographics. The phonographics program, which is tied to that book, Reading Reflex, had influenced their phonics part.
So it is structured in a way that is, in some ways, very in line with what we're used to in reading instruction. And there is a tremendous amount of spiraling and materials. One of the things that I love about it is they use topics that there's a minimal amount of prior knowledge about. So the kids that come from maybe more well-to-do backgrounds don't necessarily have a leg up or an advantage compared to others. From my view, I'm like, it doesn't have a great spelling program, and it doesn't have what I'm used to in terms of hardcore writing in isolation, but it's so much more integrated. Ken, what I thought was interesting is the first training or so, a part of this program is nothing about the program, but they just teach about the science of reading. The first training is legitimately science of reading, as if in some capacities what we've heard in college, but taking to the next level of saying this is what is designated as successful growth in reading. And then we kind of infuse the curriculum into it. And I just found it so much more interesting as opposed to opening the book and just reading what's in front of us, trusting whatever that measure is, and using that as the background of why certain decisions were made in that curriculum. I found fascinating. But using the science can do a lot of that justification. Marnie, kind of like you're saying, you witnessed that experience, sold you on it, probably a few days or even sooner, taking the reading reflex and bringing it into your classroom. You knew that it was different almost immediately, and that's what gets us so excited when we're seeing results. I'll use that same weight loss style feedback, right?
Right.
So,
I lost 5 pounds.
and that just kind of creates that snowball effect that you go so much further. So continuing that conversation of the science of reading and pulling that into maybe your understanding of student development, what really sticks out to you about the research that you've read that might be different than what we normally consider instruction regarding reading?
Well, there are so many different communities of practice, so it's hard to know which angle to take, because most of the country is still using a balanced literacy mindset to teach kids how to read words, which is a variation of whole language, in my opinion. And phonics is definitely taught, but it can be haphazard, or it can be not aligned with enough reading practice. And so it doesn't often work for a majority of the kids. But then there's this movement, as you're alluding to, the science of reading movement. And there's a lot that's sweeping the country and actually the world. And that's heavily saying you need to teach phonics, not do just immersion and not just haphazard or embedded phonics instruction. Both of them have some things that I think we could improve upon. So we know that a more systematic approach to teaching decoding than is typically provided in a balanced literacy classroom would be helpful. We also know that knowledge building systematically, or at least we have theory, we have a little less experimental proof, but we have theory to back up the idea that systematic building of knowledge is going to help kids in all areas of life, but also especially reading, because teaching reading is a half of it is teaching content. When you're a good reader, you know a lot of stuff. On the phonics side, this again goes back to what I was alluding to earlier, that was that insight in reading reflex. And they're not the only ones that have had this insight, but they're still in the minority. It's phonics is not enough. And when people have been talking about phonemic awareness, because there's a huge amount of research on it in the last 40 years, a lot of phonics programs, they just tacked it on, what you might even call a phonemic awareness or phonological awareness patch. But the research is actually probably is more suggestive that if we put the pieces together for the kids from the very beginning and they build and manipulate, read and spell words, they'll pick up the code more rapidly. They'll crack the code. They'll start to they'll read more and more words, and it'll stick for them. So it's a subtle difference. I talk about it as a weaving metaphor. You're putting the pieces, all the sub processes together early on instead of a building blocks. Like you have to do your letter names, then you do your letter sounds. You have to do your phonological awareness, like the syllable level or the rhyme level, and then you get to phoneme awareness, and you put all these blocks in place, and then you start looking at 3-sound decodable words like cat and sat and mop. That's our mainstream phonics approach. But I learned from reading Reflex, and I've been building it into the programs that I've created since then. And I think the research defends this, is when you put the things together from the beginning, it makes more sense to kids and they learn it more quickly.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that? In comparison to what you just said.
With reading Simplified, if you have a 5-year-old first day of school, we would say, we're going to build a word today. And we'd if it was a whole class thing, we might put 3 lines on the board, and I would run my finger along those lines. As I said, we're going to build the word map. What do you hear at the beginning of map? And some of the kids are going to say, and if they don't, then we'll coach them through it. And I elongate and exaggerate so that phoneme awareness, the perception of that individual sound, if they don't have it, we can coach them to develop it. And so then, yeah, you're right. This is and I would have 3 little letter sound cards on the board, scrambled up, and I would say, which one of these is And some of them are going to know it. And if they don't, I would say, well, you're right. Or no, this one is Everybody say, I'm going to pull it down, and we're all going to say, And then we start building the rest of the word. What do you hear next in the word map? Map. You kind of exaggerate the sound. They start to pick it up. Which one of these is ah? And so you build the word map. Everybody check it. Okay, you guys read your first word. They may not have known how to segment. They may not have known M, A, or P at the beginning of that lesson, but they're going to just kind of learn it because it's a multiple choice and there's a lot of instructional scaffolding. But more importantly, you've taught them the alphabetic principle right there. You've taught them that our written language is a code for sounds. Instead, a typical balanced literacy class might not do letters the first day. They might read a book, which is really great. There's so many things that are from a balanced literacy perspective that we still want to, we don't want to throw out. But a phonics classroom might just hold up maybe A, and we talk about A, alligator, and some of the kids have no clue what you're talking about. Okay, there's this squiggle, and I'm going to say but it's meaningless to some of our kids if they haven't had certain preparatory experiences and they don't have good phonemic awareness. And so a lot of the kindergarten curricula will go that way until maybe the 13th week. We've done all the alphabet. We've done a lot of phonological awareness. And now let's read the word sat. Well, in a reading simplified classroom, those kids are way past short vowel words at that point, or if they're not past it, they're reading them and not just getting started, simply because we just stopped the whole building block metaphor and we just emphasized the context of words with the same sub skills, but just put it together for them more quickly.
So you're putting them in the experiential learning right out of the gate. Whether or not they know what the letter M is, they can still identify the sound that they hear. And then looking at the 3 choices, they know it, or you explain it. You read the letters, and then you're again emphasizing those sounds. Is that kind of what you're getting at from that launch perspective? That makes sense. So let's shift gears slightly. I am a 6th grade teacher, like you were, and I realize that I have 1, 5, 8 students that are way below my reading level. Let's acknowledge the fact that I have to continue with the pace of my curriculum for the most part, but what are little small group lessons or little differentiation activities that I can give to these students to try to build up their skills to get them a little bit closer to my grade level, other than just giving them scaffolded reading that's below
easier
grade level.
text. Yeah. Well, the first thing that I like to do is suggest a nonsense word test for the older kids. So you actually pinpoint, is this really a decoding problem? A lot of the times it is. And that's not to say that's the only problem, because if they haven't been reading for many years, they probably are limited on their vocabulary and spelling and all the things. But again, back to what's their most pressing need, the thing that's the foundational thing is that if there's sound-based decoding approach, if they don't have that skill, then everything builds on top of that. So nonsense words will reveal that to you. You can use an informal assessment, or you can find a standardized one. We have some of both that we recommend on our website at readingsimplified.com, but if you don't have anything in your district already. So once you figure that out, odds are you're going to say, yeah, these kids aren't really reading up to stuff for 6th grade in their decoding. So then it's probably great to first start in some activities that will attack that and solve that problem. One of our most popular ones is called Switch It, because it does so much so quickly for so many kids who have sound-based decoding problems. And if you go back to that little map example, I would do this in 6th grade classroom. I would do this in a small group with dry erase boards. On the back of the dry erase board, I have little lines. And instead of just building one word, we would switch words. So at the 6th grade level, these kids would probably be starting out at like 5 sounds. So you have the word stomp. Everybody build the word stomp. They got these little letter sound cards. Okay, we're going to change stomp into stump. Which sound are you going to take away? And which sound what sound are you going to add? And pull it down and say, Is that what I came up with? Stomp, stomp? Yeah. Okay, great. Now we're going to change stomp to slump. And then you just change as many positions in the word as you can. And there's something powerful about those paired contrasts and then the analysis of the phonemes and the graphemes, or the sounds and the spellings, that kind of unlocks stuff for the kids that they weren't getting. It's like light bulbs go off. We hear this so practically every day in our community. It's unbelievable. They say, I can't believe it. They're just like, the discovery process is very cool with this activity, and it only takes like 5 minutes, and most kids think it's a game. And that's helpful for the middle school, upper, or even the high school situation, because you're actually going back to beginning phonics. So it could feel like it's too baby, but because there's a little game element to it, and you don't start with cat, then that works. That's a huge thing that helps. A second thing that helps is a sorted activity. So a lot of these kids the phonics information is just kind of scrambled. They have a lot of holes. And so the odds are they don't know the short vowels reliably. And so Switch It will help with that when you change stomp to stump. And that's really going to help with the short vowels. But then they see OU and OA and OW, and it's all just they don't have an automatic thing that pops out as a reliable choice. So Sort It is an activity where we organize words by sound. So we would teach the O sound, but it could be O as in go, or O as in boat, or O as in show, or O as in home and toe. So they read these words, you got a list of them, and then they can just make columns on a paper. They read the word, they decide whether it goes under OA or O or OW or O separated E or OE by itself. In middle school, you might throw in OUGH2 as in doe or although. And then after they read that word and they figured out where it goes, then they say the sounds as they do it. This is, again, another powerful brain hack that connects those sounds and symbols that's kind of not been connecting really well for them. And so they would say shh, oh. So they don't say SHOW, and they don't say shh, why, they just write the S and then finish with the H, but they're writing shh the whole time they're saying they're saying shh the whole time they're writing the S and the H. And those two activities are really helpful for then practicing real text. So if they can read aloud and you give feedback, that's the third most powerful thing. So if they get to the word although, some of the times we just give it to them. But the more powerful thing would be to, grab the pencil or a pen, tap that OUGH and say, this is O, or try O. so that they still do the work of blending the sounds and working through it in their brain. Like, how am I supposed to crack the code in this word? But you give them the one piece of information that they need. And that's not going to solve all the problems, but those three things right there, switched activity, sorted activity, which also could be pretty quick, 5-8 minutes. You don't have to do a ton of words. And then coaching them when they make a mistake, when they orally read, with as minimal amount of information. Like, what's the one, usually there's just one thing, sometimes two, but if you can figure out what's the one thing that's keeping them from having success with that word, it's generative for them. So I don't care so much about the word although, but they're going to get a little bit better about OUGH, about the process of blending sounds, every time I have that interaction with them.
One of the things, Ken, real quick, and you can feel free to chime in. I have found in some recent math trainings that trying to avoid rote memorization style skills, that it's a lot of the early reading instruction seems to kind of match the breaking of traditional ways of teaching, what you're referencing, Marnie, like the idea of skip counting, but not always counting in one direction. We always skip count upwards. If I'm counting by 3, 6, 9, 12, but do we ever go back and forth and have that more flexible thought? And there's just a little like thumbs up if I want you to go up by 3, down, and the kids know that we're finishing at 30, but we might get all the way to 27 and then we're going all the way back to 6 or whatever the case may be. But it adds very similarly to what you're saying, that flexibility of looking at the words, looking at the numbers at a level of depth, totally different than just see it, say it, or see it, guess it, into thinking about it, processing, putting all of those features together and really attacking it more than anything in a more active way. So I just saw when you were saying unlocking that code, I feel like that is a little deja vu, because we've been looking at number sense so often, and that is, at least in math instruction, what we find such a deficit in is kids can identify what a number is, but they really have a difficult time visualizing. And even my fourth graders may know that 7 is larger than 4, but can't visualize 7 of something compared to 4 as well as I would assume that they can. And until you have that understanding, very similar to this early reading skills, you're going to struggle to really piece the understanding behind it, which is that next layer. So sorry to cut you off there, Ken.
No, it's okay. It's kind of what I was thinking too. The theme that I'm hearing from you that I really like is this discovery piece. And I am a huge proponent of that in instruction. And to be perfectly honest, it's just not something that I really thought about from a reading to read standpoint. It was a strategy that I used in my reading class for exploring content, right? Or exploring comprehension skills. It was a huge part of math. I would teach my students how to add fractions, or I'm sorry, I would let my students discover how to add fractions through the use of manipulatives and pictures and a systemized way for them to realize the pattern. And then I would teach them and reinforce that in science using phenomena for them to observe and then applying the vocabulary to that. So I love what you're sharing, and it really is relatively simple. Like you said in the beginning, one of the quotes I wrote down, reading is not that hard to do, right? We have students that have disabilities that will make it hard for them. But like you said, when you're making it very simplified, I wonder where you came up with you came up with the name for your program. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But it just all makes sense. And so what I'm wondering is, how do you encourage how do you encourage teachers to work with students in small groups or one-on-one groups? How should they group their students? Because doing some of these strategies with a classroom of 30 at the same time is not going to work well, right? So I am a huge proponent, Matt knows, of small group instruction, something that I did pretty much on a daily basis. I present a lot about it. I coach teachers on it a lot. So what ideas do you have for figuring out ways to group your students into a small group or where are the times where it has to be one-on-one if those times exist as well?
Right. Well, as Matt said, with his recent professional development, they emphasize the science of reading. If you have, sorry, if you have a conception of how reading develops, it's easier to see where your kids are in groups and then flexibly move them around and know where to go from A to B to C, as we talked about earlier. But if you have a lot of mandated curriculum, and it's kind of everybody has to do this on Monday and everybody has to do this on Tuesday, and everybody's doing the same thing no matter regardless of their level, it's a lot harder to do differentiation and to do groups. So with Reading Simplified, we're trying to provide a curricular approach that allows for this flexibility in grouping kids. And I think that that's the way, just as you said, Ken, to get the kids the best instruction, because you can meet their needs. And even when they're 5, their reading levels are already wildly variable. So we would assess kids' reading level first, back to what I got started with in my 6th grade year, just what's their reading level overall, and then get into some of these sub skills, like can they blend sounds? Do they know their basic letter sounds? Do they know consonant digraphs like CH and CK? Can they segment words? So a 5-year-old won't necessarily be able to hear the sounds in sun, and some will. And so then you can group by some of these categories and these subcategories, particularly, well, it really depends on the level. But once you've got, say, some kids that are poor at segmenting, they probably are also maybe not that knowledgeable about a few letter sounds. And then you know what to do. We're going to work on some activities that are going to build these letter sounds while we're building segmenting and manipulating. But of course, you're also going to read. With Reading Simplified, we have a simple 3-part lesson plan. So everybody's going to do rereading for fluency, word work, and guided oral reading. In the word work, we only have a handful of activities. I told you about Build It, which I didn't mention, but that's the first activity when we introduce the first day of kindergarten, maybe how to build the word map. And Switch It is when we're changing the sound. But then we would also do Read It, which is how to blend the sound. So and then I mentioned Sort It a minute ago. So these are different activities, but basically in terms of the grouping. So if you're with this struggling 5-year-old group that doesn't know how to segment, then we would do Build It. It's an easier version of Switch It. We would choose the letter sounds that they don't know yet, coupled throwing in some that they do, MASTP. But maybe we have a kid who's already reading Frog and Toad. That we would do a harder activity like Switch It, and we wouldn't start it with 3-sound words. We would start maybe with Stomp and Stump already, or maybe a 4-sound word, CVCC. And then we would do Sort It, and instead of being at the short vowel level, we would do like the O activity. So that the handful of activities and a kind of consistent lesson plan enables us to have some routines and things to fall back on. But then we have a diagnostic framework that helps us know, well, these kids need this level of words, these kids need this level of words, these kids need this level of words, and the books to match. And that's an important part of the system that was missing in a lot of balanced literacy classrooms. Even when they threw in phonics, because of the National Reading Panel, they would teach a lesson on short A, and then they read a text that doesn't have a short A word in it. And that was a mismatch. So it's like, teaching skip counting the 3s and teaching all about 3s, but then just going and doing something with 1s. Just nobody would do that, but it was kind of a quirk. So that is that's to answer your first question, and I forgot your second question. Was it different? Did I cover it all? Okay.
I'm going to take this opportunity to get some professional development. I'm struggling with this concept. I've been dealing with it for a little bit, and I don't want to be the old man get off my lawn type. But being an upper elementary teacher, the responsibility often switches from learning how to read to reading for content and reading for benefit. And when you have a class of 25 kids in front of you and you recognize that there are 4 or 5 very delayed readers in that group, but you still have the responsibility of exposure to fourth or fifth grade or sixth grade level curriculum. It starts shifting, at least in my building as a Title I school, to a tier 2, tier 3 special ed possible support. I am starting to develop, and please adjust my perspective, I am starting to develop it stops being a little bit of my responsibility to teach these early reading features, because I still need to figure out coping mechanisms for them to access as much of on grade level as possible. And they've just gone through 3, 4, 5 years of early reading intensive support. So what is your guidance to a regular ed teacher that may have some desire to help kids unlock reading, which is an easy skill, but also recognizing that there's a lot bigger things that I also need to be meeting, and the responsibility of kids that might be on grade level as well?
Well, this is so hard because, and this is what I faced, and both of you, I'm sure, are facing it. And it's a systemic problem that the classroom teacher can only do so much. I mean, that's why I left teaching. I was like, I want to solve this problem about kids who can't read. And if I stay a sixth grade teacher, I'll be frustrated. Like, I'll always be fighting against the grade of my curriculum, my standards. And now the standards in the curricula are even more demanding than they were when I was a teacher. So my first message would be to anyone who's listening, who has the, administrative power. Our kids who cannot read deserve a radically different approach. They need to get the most expert instruction with a lot of intensity, and they should be expected to get to grade level. Only a very small minority of kids should continue to struggle year after year. But we have wide swaths of our children not getting to grade level, and that's a systemic problem, because we have decided that after first grade, maybe second grade, we're really not teaching reading, and we're not going to move heaven and earth to get these kids' reading problem solved. But if they don't learn to read, they can't do the math, the social studies, the science. They don't feel good about themselves. They end up quitting school. They're more likely to get in poverty. 75% of inmates are functionally illiterate. There's even reduced lifetime outcomes for people with low literacy levels. It is the most important thing besides safety and emotional, nurturing that the school can do. So we need to turn everything on its head until we solve that problem. And I've seen that done sometimes where, it's all hands on deck. If we have a fourth grader who's reading at the second grade level, they're going to get this kind of instruction, and then somebody else is going to come in and read with them again, and somebody else is going to do this and that, and it's tricky because you want to make sure they have some of the fun of school too. But really, do they need to learn about the Revolutionary War if they can't read? I'm all in about the Revolutionary War. I was a social studies teacher. I think background knowledge is pivotal, but I'm just throwing out a random thing. Like, they could probably get by if they're not that great about the Revolutionary War, if they can at least read the words revolutionary, and then they can learn more about history later. And I think what's the only reason that I'm saying this is these radical things is that I have experienced that most kids can learn to read. So it's a lot of inefficient curricula and systems that are not finding these kids and giving them the best instruction with the most intensity. That's what researchers have showed us. They can, in a research environment with struggling kids with enough intensity, kids can learn to read. Almost everyone. So that's the message to people who can change the system. If you're a teacher, though, there's only so much you can do. I did a lot of read alouds and putting kids on books on tape, if anybody knows what those are. Because I wanted them to have access to stuff that they were capable of understanding and enjoying and keep up with the rest of the class. So that would be one of my compensating mechanisms. But then I would try to, over on the side, like I did with those two boys, can I actually get you to to learn how to read these words so then you next year can keep up with the class. But it is not easy, Matt. I don't mean to imply that. But that would be my my juggling throughout the year, and then simultaneously thinking about, really critical about the curriculum. Okay, I'm going to let them read this book. We're all going to read this book, but if they don't have time to master the spelling words that we're studying that's tied to this book, maybe that's okay, because I'm going to get them to read, and spelling can come later. Knowing the vocabulary for the Revolutionary War, it can maybe even come later. Even some math concepts, science, art, all of it is like, the reading is the thing. Obviously, I'm a little bit of bias on that, but there's a lot of sociological and evidence to prove that reading is life-changing and so devastating to those who don't have the access.
It makes sense. And Matt, I know you're playing devil's advocate for that question. I think it was a great question. And differentiation is the hardest thing to do in teaching, regardless of what we're teaching. And you can relate it back to math. If the students don't have a basic understanding of the operations, they're not going to be able to handle finding volume and doing upper level concepts. And so
that's a good analogy.
You do have to continue to find ways to scaffold the students to participate in the curriculum you're teaching, while also creating opportunities to build those foundational skills. Like you said, is looking at what you're teaching, is this critical for the students to participate in? If it's not critical, then you pull them out of that and you do those foundational lessons. If what you're teaching is, and what do I mean by critical? I think that's for the teachers to decide. That's why we're professionals. But I could sit back in my 5th grade math class and say, yeah, this is a great math lesson. This is a great concept that I want to continue to do in my classroom. It's good for the students to be exposed to it. It generates maybe some higher level problem solving skills. But if someone were to miss this lesson, if they were to be absent, I probably wouldn't force them to make it up, because it won't impact their understanding of the concepts in the next unit. So when you hit those lessons, that's the perfect opportunity to set up that small group instruction and say, you're going to do this today instead of what the other students are doing, so that you can build in that time to work on those foundational skills. So I would love to hear more of your strategies, but we'll get from you at the end some opportunities for teachers to get your resources. So I want to jump into our exit ticket, which is the same 4 questions we ask every guest every week. Question number 1, what is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
That's tough. I love that question. Even though, well, the first thing that came to me was not teach them to read, but actually just care for them and know them and care for them. That's the first step.
I think, honestly, what you're saying is all your research has been driven by caring for them and wanting them to see success. So I think that's a great answer. I appreciate this conversation has come from your realization, your frustration, your desire to find the answer. But what is the best piece of advice that you've received? And it could have come from a colleague, a supervisor, or even a student.
The other thing that was really pivotal in my career was just, how the heck do you manage these kids, 11-year-olds? There's 30 of them. I don't know. So when I first heard, I'm blanking on his name. His last name is Wong, Harry Wong's book about how to just set up your classroom. It's a classic. And that was very pivotal. And then I learned from the 2 sisters who developed the Daily 5 about just teaching the processes. And I was like, lightning bolt, why didn't anyone tell me this? If you teach the process, it's over and over, teach the good version of it, teach the bad version of it, teach it until you get it. And then you can actually teach your class. that was really revelatory, and it shouldn't have been, because I was well into my career before I figured all that
When
out.
the Daily Five got dropped on my desk, I was like, this is so straightforward, but it is, so impactful.
There's a lot of great stuff in there.
So real quick, I just want to say the book you're referencing, is it The Classroom Management Book? Is that the title of it? It's by Harry K. Wong.
They might have changed
Okay.
the title. I think now it's coming to me. I think it was called The First Day of School.
I'm looking at 2 books by him. The other one is The First Days of School: How to Be an Effective Teacher.
Yeah. I was reading that like it was a Bible for like pretty much every year at the beginning for
I'm
weeks.
Link both of those in our show notes page.
And I may be reading that one to refresh myself. So
I have that book. Matt,
no, you're experiencing it. I didn't last that long. You probably figured all that out.
The First Days of
I only
School.
lasted 3 years.
My co-op gave it to me as a departing present for when I finished my student teaching.
I love it. So the next question really talks about enduring the school year. So we recognize as educators that the school year goes in waves. And you were a successful educator. I know you've mentioned that you've left education or formal public education because of some justifiable reasons. But what is something you feel like every educator needs to hear to help power up through those moments of struggle?
Mm-hmm. I think it kind of depends on the person's personality. Mine is very goal driven. And so I would need to have a goal of taking care of myself instead of just getting achievement out of my kids. But then there are other people that might need a goal of having fun with their kids, or just jotting down what progress have they seen, because I think that's one of the things that you get weary about. He's just like, this isn't happening, this isn't happening, this isn't happening. But actually, let's note what with little Johnny, what happened Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday that were incremental growth steps. And that's what I've always done, particularly when I've had a truly deeply dyslexic student. They don't pick up reading nearly as quickly as the majority of children. And I get to like my 6 week of lesson. I'm like, we're just not getting there. And then I look back and say, okay, this is where we were. And I'm looking at my notes and maybe doing a little assessment to say, okay, we've come this far. It's not as the leaps ahead that I would expect, but given the context, this is still progress. And so validating your work.
I love that. I thought that was a great answer, and one we haven't really heard before. Last question. It is easy for teachers to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What do you think separates the teachers who are the ones constantly seeking to change, innovate, and adopt new teaching strategies?
Well, it kind of goes back to the previous one. I think some of the teachers that are doing the same thing over and over again are burnt out. So take care of yourself so you have the energy to innovate. And remember why you became a teacher. It's like Simon Sinek says, what is your why? That if your why is that you became a teacher because you want to make a difference, go back to that, meditate on that. And that would probably drive you away from too much repetition and looking towards more of the goal of reaching these kids, whether it's that emotional need that they have or some sort of academic need.
Love it. So Marnie, I have to say that I appreciate people like you because I am not the type that loves diving into research. I like people to dive in the research and tell me the best strategy. So thank you for what you do. For our audience, what is the best way to continue to connect with you, to learn from you, and the great things you're doing for education?
Thank you, Matt. You could find me at readingsimplified.com. We have a lot of complimentary videos and word lists and how-tos there. For instance, if folks thought that switch it idea was interesting, you could go to readingsimplified.com and /switch-it and get word lists to get started, how to do it, how to give feedback, which is one of the key things, and some little video examples. And if you're a middle school teacher, that one will only show you little kids, but I have also a middle school version. So if you just go to my website and type middle school, you could find that.
Marnie, thank you so much. We will link up to all of your resources, websites, social media handles, all that in our show notes page, which you can find wherever you're listening or watching right now by scrolling down or going to our website at poweredup.com. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's definitely a little bit outside of what I would consider what I did best in the classroom, but you really, no pun intended, simplified things for us. I think it's really easy for an experienced teacher to just step back and realize the strategies that are right there in front of them that they can start to dial into their classroom, and also for newer teachers and experienced teachers looking to dive deeper to check out your resources and the programs you have set up for them. So we will link up to all that and share that out with our audience. So thank you again for joining us. And Matt, why don't you take us on out of here?
All right. As we power down this episode, without a doubt, you left us feeling powered up. Thank you for the time, and everyone listening, stay well, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to or watching us on YouTube. Each week, we get to talk to amazing educators who are making a positive impact on the lives of students, their colleagues, administrators, and education as a whole. It's been such a privilege every week to be able to talk to these incredible individuals, learn from them, grow with them, and better myself and all of education through these conversations. If you haven't already, please consider sharing this with a colleague, someone who can benefit and be powered up from the experience of listening to these incredible conversations. Because of Powered Up, we are powering education by empowering you.